In this fourth and final video on the history of American religion, we'll look at the period from the 1930s through pretty much the present day. The Great Depression of the 1930s profoundly impacted Americans and transformed American religion. Now, on one hand, you got the economic collapse, and that's obviously going to negatively impact a number of churches financially. But on the other hand, the churches were under, real pressure to expand their roles in the social gospel. Churches were pivotal in charitable relief efforts such as soup kitchens and food distribution that, of course, kept people alive. More fundamentally, the whole daggone collapse of the economy made people question traditions and the role of government. Is there a God? Would God allow such suffering? And so, the economic collapse posed sort of an existential threat. During both the Great Depression and World War II, Christian organizations such as the Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, and the Salvation Army, both of which had been founded in the 19th century, worked to help the poor and the displaced, and to maintain traditional faith. This wasn't easy. For one, the war raised questions about pacifism, often dividing religions, while instances of obvious mistreatment, such as the internment of Japanese American, again posed deep questions. Now, undoubtedly, the evil nature of the Nazis and, of course, the Holocaust raised existential questions about the nature of man and religious faith. Again, does God exist? Would God allow such suffering? Certainly, we wanted to cast ourselves as the good guys in World War II, and Franklin Roosevelt spoke of the U.S. fighting to protect four freedoms worldwide. One of them, which was the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. Thousands of chaplains served throughout World War II, primarily Protestant and Catholic, but trying to serve the spiritual needs of all the servicemen. They were often in combat as well. After World War II, religion again played a prominent role in the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, of course, a communist nation, and they sort of exemplified the Marxist idea that religion was a tool to keep the masses down, and so that we were the upholders of traditional religion and in our view, God. So there's after the turmoil of the Depression and World War II, and with the Cold War going on, everybody kind of longed for more traditions. And you really see the 50s being their traditional nuclear family. The mother was the homemaker, and the father was provider. And it also meant that traditional faith. We're trying to get back to when things weren't so crazy before the Depression and the war. And not surprisingly, during the 1950s, during the Cold War, churches flourished. Just like in the 1920s when radio was new, several preachers used the new medium of television to win converts. And one of the most prominent of the televangelists was Billy Graham. And Billy Graham would go around the country and have these crusades like, preachers before. And he would draw thousands. He would counsel presidents, and he was always making an effort to be nonpartisan, and he met with both Democratic and Republican presidents. In politics, religion was an issue in the 1960 election when John Kennedy won the Democratic nomination. Now, John Kennedy was Catholic, and America had never elected a Catholic president. And what Kennedy did was he went before a bunch of Protestant preachers in Houston, and he gave a very famous speech. And he said, as you can see here, I'm not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic. He reassured them that while he would follow the Pope and the Catholic Church in his personal matters, he would follow the Constitution in his public duties. And that satisfied the ministers, and sure enough, Kennedy, of course, was elected. During the 1960s, there was, of course, the African American Civil Rights Movement, and religious leaders were a key part of that. Obviously, you have Martin Luther King, who was a reverend, but there were Catholic priests and others. Not all religious leaders supported the Civil Rights Movement, of course. A lot of these Southern Protestants did not. By the 1960s, the growing urbanization and diversification of American society increased the pressure to loosen traditional connections between church and state. They also contributed to the rise of secular humanism, which concludes that a moral code can exist outside of religion. For the longest time, people were claiming that if it wasn't for constraints of religion, people would just go crazy and hurt each other. Well, secular humanism says that innately there's a sense of right and wrong in mankind. You can see the pressure that the growing diversification had on the American churches when in 1962 the Supreme Court made a famous decision in Engel versus Vital that public teacher-led public prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. You could have private students or students outside of school, of course, praying, but you couldn't have a teacher leading a denominational or one faith prayer. Everybody paid taxes to support the public schools, and not everybody believed in that faith. Now, this is really going to upset a lot of fundamentalists and preachers, and a lot of the traditions. They'd had Christian denominational prayers, and so this is going to be a real important decision in launching the religious right, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. Of course, traditional religion, which the 1950s sort of stressed, was also challenged by the changing mores regarding sex. Now, in the early 1960s, they invented the first birth control pill, and for the first time, having sex, you could be pretty assured that you would not get pregnant. And this, of course, is before the day of AIDS or herpes, and with penicillin, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and the traditional sexually transmitted diseases could be cured. And so this is going to loosen constraints on traditional faith, which said that sex was just for married people, not for unmarried people, and certainly not for any type of extramarital affairs. By the 1960s, of course, you have the counterculture and the hippies, and this is going to affect religion in a lot of ways. A lot of the young people adopted Jesus Christ as sort of a early hippie. He was projected as having the long hair, and he preached love, and he was a sort of a counterculture in his day. So the Jesus that the young people of the 60s accepted was a type of Christ that really hadn't existed elsewhere. And also, of course, the sexual revolution, as I say, was embraced by these young people, which again is going to challenge traditional faiths. There was free love in the 60s. If it feels good, do it. Again, this shocked the hippies, the counterculture, the sexual revolution. It all shocked traditions, and it was meant to shock traditions, I'd say, in a lot of ways. And it's going to sort of invariably have a backlash. Tied in with the counterculture and, of course, with the sexual revolution was the women's liberation movement. This is really going to be another impetus for the rise of the religious right. The women's liberation movement said that women should be considered equal in all respects to men. And traditionally, religions, certainly Christian Protestant religions, taught that the father was the head of the family and the servant leader of the family. That God created the nuclear family and meant for men to be out in business and politics and women to be home and sort of lovingly obey type of thing. And the women's liberation movement challenged that. Women should have every bit of access to things that the men did. And this was, again, a challenge to traditional religion. The Equal Rights Amendment, which Congress passed in the 1970s and Richard Nixon signed, was sent to the states for ratification and represented this sort of women's liberation movement. The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, said that it had any law, local, state, or national, could not differentiate on the basis of gender or sex. Now, it was passed by Congress and it was signed by the president, but it was had to be, because it was a constitutional amendment, it had to be ratified by a supermajority of the states. So it was sent to the states for ratification during the Nixon presidency. Another, of course, monumental decision and sort of spurring on the religious right was the issue of abortion. Abortion had been illegal in many states prior to the 1970s. And when Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade, what they concluded was that a woman had a constitutional right, in the Constitution, a right to privacy from government intrusion, to have an abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy. In the second 3 months, the government could, state governments could regulate it, and in the final 3 months, you couldn't have a pregnancy terminated by abortion. And what it did, therefore, was enshrine in the Constitution a individual right to abortion and a right against government intrusion, a privacy right. Now, this is really going to upset a lot of traditional faiths. It's like the Catholic faith, which had long argued that life began at the conception. Now, a lot of the Protestant faiths who had been antagonistic to the Catholics didn't see Roe v. Wade as that big a deal. The Baptists, for example, were split on the issue when Roe v. Wade passed. But as the religious right grows, the reaction to the counterculture, the women's liberation movement, the sexual liberation, the prayer in schools and all that, you're going to see more and more, certainly Protestant religions in the South, turning against abortion rights. You can see this emergent religious right in the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter came to the presidency sort of in the wake of the whole Watergate fiasco scandal. And Carter was a Georgia governor who had claimed to be born again. Now, you know from earlier videos that born again sort of tied into that evangelical conservative strain of Protestants. And a lot of these people saw in Jimmy Carter one of their own, and so they voted for him. Carter famously said he wouldn't lie to people. He went by Jimmy, which is very familiar, known to very evangelical in that way. He gave an interview to Playboy magazine, and even admitted that he wasn't above sin and he lusted after women. And he promised, like I say, never to lie. And a lot of these conservative religious types that were angry over the changing culture voted for Carter in 1976. The thing was, Carter was a Democrat, and the Democrats had been, there's a party, had been embracing a lot of the youth vote and a lot of the counterculture vote. And so Carter was in an awkward situation with both the conservative religious element and the more liberal elements of his party sort of battling to control his administration. While ERA had been passed and signed by Nixon, it hadn't been ratified, and it was during Jimmy Carter's presidency that conservative Christians were really influential in leading to the ultimate failure of ERA ratification. It was during Carter's presidency that positions began to solidify on the issue of abortion. I had mentioned that a lot of Protestant churches had not been really decisive on where they stood with regard to abortion. Well, this is by the 70s, late 70s and the 80s, you're going to see these conservative Christian traditional sort of movement, stronger in the South, sort of coalescing around what they called a pro-life position. And people that supported abortion rights became known as sort of pro-choice. And again, Carter was caught in the middle of this. He would denounce abortion, but he didn't think the government should interfere in people's private lives. Now, I've mentioned in regard to Billy Graham the role of television. And with the 70s, you begin to see cable television becoming very, very popular. And several evangelical preachers were ahead of the curve preaching in cable television, longer shows, and this is going to be yet another modern platform for them to spread their faith and their views. One of the leaders in the televangelist movement, of the cable television movement of the 1970s, was the Virginia pastor Jerry Falwell. He founded an organization called the Moral Majority, he called it. And it was, an elaborate television show, and he was sort of the leader in the formation of these coalescing conservative Christians politically, and is going to be one of the instigators of the religious right. By the 1980s, conservative Christians had rallied and were starting to rally to the Republican Party. And they, ever since the 1920s in the Scopes trial, many conservative Christians, certainly Christian fundamentalists, had been sort of burned by the Scopes trial and were gone back to saving individual souls. Well, the 1960s kind of brought them back into the political battles. And by the 1970s and 1980s, you really see the beginning formation of the religious right. Now, if you use the term religious right, you tend to think of the Republican Party. And indeed, and by the 1980s in the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party embraced the religious right and its causes, while the Democrats sort of embraced multiculturalism and the separation of church and state. Also, beginning in the 1980s, on the fringe of the religious right, certainly not in the mainstream of them, was a growing Christian Reconstruction movement among conservative religious communities. It sought to make God's law the civic law of the land. In other words, it completely sought to break down all separation of church and state. Now, this, of course, was not the view of the mainstream religious right. People like Jerry Falwell or later on Pat Robertson, another televangelist preacher. But it was out there, and you really see the cultural wars starting to develop. For example, there was a fight over religion in public education. I mentioned the Engel versus Vitale Supreme Court case. Well, yeah, a lot of conservative Christians in the religious right wanted to have tax credits and federal funding for private or religious schools. They saw the government schools as indoctrinating them. And so there's going to be all this fight over the role of religion in public education. That's part of the culture. Of course, in the 1980s, there was the acquired immune deficiency syndrome pandemic, or AIDS, and it first spread among the homosexual community. And not surprisingly, some of the religious right argued that that was the wrath of God, because homosexuality, these religious communities, conservative religious communities, argued was a sin, and so God was taking retribution. This angered a lot of people on the political left, of course. There was fights over the role of religion on public lands. Can you take a Christian symbol like a cross and put it on lands that everybody's tax dollars goes to support? Of course, after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, there's going to be a lot of growing anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, and that's also going to sort of end up being politically. The political left, the embracing multiculturalism, complained that political conservatives were denying, Muslims in America their rights. And you can see here anti-Muslim hate crimes began to grow. In the 1990s and in the early 2000s, you see in certainly conservative communities the growth of mega churches. Churches become the center of the people's community. And so you have these religious services, and they're broadcast on television, and they draw literally thousands, but the churches become like a community center. They have activities, everything from basketball and bowling, and they have their attendance schools next to them, and they're really like community centers. In the 1990s and 2000s, there's the growth of non-denominational and Bible churches. Again, they tend to skew a little bit more conservative and traditional in their faiths, but they're not Baptists, they're not Methodists, they're not Presbyterians. They are independent, and they kind of just go what the pastor preaches out of the Bible. So all of this tied into the cultural wars. The religion is an integral part of all of these issues, and it divides blue states and red states today. With the growth of traditional conservative religions, in the presidency of Bill Clinton, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And it was designed, as you can see here, to make it harder for federal government to interfere with a person's freedom of religion unless there is a, quote, compelling government interest. Now this was a sort of a high watermark for conservative religious faith, but the thing was, it's a lot of things that they saw as religious freedom, other people saw as religious as liberty. For example, gay rights. Many conservatives refused to serve in their private businesses people that were gay or lesbian, and when they deny the gay and lesbian, when they offer those business opportunities or customers service otherwise, but deny it to gay and lesbians, the question is, was that a violation of the rights of the gay and lesbians? Well, in 2015, Oberfeld versus Hodges, the Supreme Court ruled that gays could have marriage rights, and it was sort of moving in the direction of recognizing gender discrimination to include gay and lesbians. And this was something that, again, aggravated the religious right, the conservatives, and they argued it was a violation of their religious freedom. And of course, today we see all this playing out in our politics, in our culture. Anyway, this concludes the fourth video on the period since the 1930s, and concludes the videos on the history of American religion.